Good afternoon, viewers. Welcome back to another episode of Free Marketeers podcast. Thank you very much for joining me. Thank you to all of you who have been watching our episodes during the lockdown. I hope you find them valuable and informative. We have a very special guest this week, someone who I think some of you, or at least all of you, should be aware of right now, given she's been in the news a lot. She's been causing some trouble, I think, but good trouble in that regard, trying to question some of the regulations, the laws, things like that that are coming out at the moment. I think as a conscientious and patriotic South African, that is what she is doing and what all of us should do in many ways, just because it is an emergency and people are scared about COVID-19 doesn't mean we shouldn't question some of the things coming from government, doesn't mean we shouldn't hold those in power accountable. I would argue that in an emergency, we should do that even more so. So I will introduce to you Erin Richards. Erin, thank you very much for being with us.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks so much for the invite.
Erin, just to start off with, I wanted to give you a chance to give us some background. So a few weeks ago, you and a few colleagues wrote a letter to President Ramaphosa on the National Command Council, the National COVID-19 Command Council, questioning some of the aspects of its sort of composition, how it came about, that sort of thing. Could you just give us a sort of overview of that letter and the work that you've done up until this point?
Yeah, sure. And I just want to, before I do that, just to pick up on something that you said, which is you pointed to this concept of enhanced accountability. And I think that is a concept that I feel is really fundamentally driving me. You know, on an ordinary day in South Africa, we have a constitution that says that we must have accountable and transparent government. Whether up to date, we've had that is another question. But when you sit in a situation where you have a disaster, where you have to basically force your entire citizenry of 60 million, people into lockdown, in my opinion, the Constitution then demands enhanced transparency. Mm-hmm. So if you have X amount of transparency that you need on a normal day, in a disaster, you need to amplify that. And in my opinion, you need to have excessive, possibly even amounts of transparency and accountability. Your government needs to be communicating with its citizens openly, frequently. It needs to be encouraging debate. It needs to be answering questions. And my concern is that we are seeing exactly the opposite. And it's almost as though the more questions we ask, the more confusion there is and the more bizarre the regulations and the directions become. So, legally speaking is one thing, but just watching what's going on as a citizen is very, very concerning.
Speaking of, sorry, I was interrupting you there. I was going to say, speaking of regulations, I might get in trouble for wearing this T-shirt, but we'll leave that alone for the moment.
I promise I won't rat you out. I'll give you a chance to comply, and we'll monitor the situation 24 hours. As for a summary of what happened, let me describe it from my personal perspective. When I first heard the word or the term National Coronavirus Command Council, it set off authoritarian alarm bells in my own head. And I thought, look, Erin, don't be ridiculous, don't be alarmist. Let's look in the legislation, let's look in the Act, and let's look in the Constitution to see if there's a basis for such a thing. But then I had to start with the question, well, what is the Command Council?
Right.
And I looked for a day and a half and I could find no information on it. A day and a half, that's extraordinary. Mm-hmm. Normally if you want information about a government body, you type it in and up comes some details. So, I asked some of my journalist friends and all of them came back and said, good question. Actually, we don't know what this thing is. Mm-hmm. So eventually Barry Bateman came back to me and said, look, I managed to find a tweet that says that there's 19 ministers on this thing. Okay, great. Then I started looking at the Act and the Constitution, and I could not find a basis for the establishment of this body, especially given the limited information that was available. What we were being told and what the Act and the Constitution envisaged to me seemed to be irreconcilable.
Okay.
So, a colleague of mine and I then wrote to the presidency saying, look, these are the questions that we have. Can we just get some clarity? We got a response back that didn't make much sense. And we are now, we've now reached a stage where there is going to be, verbal engagement between the parties. I can't comment on what form that meeting is going to take, exactly when it is, but as soon as it's happened, we'll update everyone. So it's been a whirlwind, but that's the summary.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask you a few specific questions in terms of maybe the Constitution, the rule of law, as well as some things we could touch on that I would like to get your perspective on. Some of these might be quite academic and dry from my perspective, but I think, I'm speaking on behalf of the viewers here, but, the more information we can get as well, I think the more useful we can be maybe going forward and pushing some of the pressure on government going forward. So the first one, I wanted to sort of touch on the work that the FMF has done in this area, and we believe it might be the case that government has gone too far in limiting our rights and has graduated to suspending them instead. What do you think? Has government gone beyond what Section 36 allows?
Yes, well, I think that, firstly, we must just caution against semantics, whether or not a right has been limited or suspended. I'm not sure that really gets to the crux of the issue.
Sure.
Section 36 of the Constitution allows rights to be limited insofar as it's reasonable and justifiable in an open and democratic society. As for what we are currently seeing, the extent of these regulations, I do not think, when you look at them as a whole, that they are even close to passing that kind of legal threshold. Obviously, you'd have to look at you can ask questions about individual regulations, and then you can look at it as a whole. There are certain general regulations that have me very worried, and obviously this is aside from blatantly ridiculous stuff like you buy certain kinds of bedding or not. I mean, I think we all know that stuff will not pass a threshold. But there are certain rights that really worry me. The first one is this curtailment of freedom of speech, where you're saying to people that you can't put out fake news, where you haven't defined what constitutes fake news. The second is this thing about tracking people, digital surveillance. And then there are these obscure regulations relating to the prohibition of e-commerce, which also seem to me just to be, I can't work out a rational justification for these regulations. I suppose those are three that immediately flag my concern.
Okay, yeah, so maybe going forward, if people are very concerned about something specific, to hone in on that and see in the within a broader context whether it makes sense or not, and then maybe, I don't know, write to organizations such as ours, or write to politicians, write to lawyers, and highlight those. I think that would be maybe a better approach, that sort of focused approach, than a scattergun/shotgun approach.
I think that point that you've raised is a brilliant one, and I've been having this debate with a couple of my colleagues. Mark Oppenheimer, you'll be familiar with, chief among them, and we were saying, is it better to target the individual regulations, or is it better to attack the broader constitutionality of the lockdown on some or other basis? And I think that there's merit to both. So if you're concerned about a individual regulation, challenge it. There's nothing stopping you, and the more we do that, the better. There's also room for broader challenges. There's no doubt about that. As for whether or not they'll be successful, one can only tell. One can only wait. I think people must understand from a legal perspective that we are in uncharted territory. Even in constitutional law, we are dealing here with governance issues, constitutional issues, lawfulness issues that have never been contemplated, by our courts, by our lawyers. So there is a lot of scope for development, and people mustn't be scared to challenge the status quo. So I think that there's room for both. My personal concern is that to date there's been too much focus on the individual regulations, and my worry about that is possibly a more political one. It's that if you're running around focusing only on the individual regulations, you might be missing a bigger picture. There might be bigger abuses of power that go to the heart of democracy that we're missing because we're focusing too much on one aspect. So I think there's room for both voices, and both should be amplified.
Okay. Okay, good. Moving on to the second question, again, touching on Section 36, on constitutionality and rationality. Do you think the courts would be open to a constitutional or rationality challenge? And I suppose this touches with what you said earlier, if one talks about specific regulations or not. But I suppose that's more of a broad question. Maybe it's also about the environment, maybe of the courts at the moment. Do you think they're in a specific spirit of that they would hear arguments or challenges like that or not? Maybe that's a bit of a broader question.
Look, no, it's a very interesting one, because the question that you're basically asking is, what is the function of a court, and how far do they go when you're in a political situation like this?
Mm-hmm.
And people will have heard a term, the separation of powers, which in layman's terms basically means that the court must stay in its lane. The court's job is to deal only with legal issues, and it must stay away from politics. So it mustn't get involved in policy decisions.
Okay.
So, for example, when the government decides that, let me take a nice example. Okay, so let's say the government takes a policy decision that lives matter more than people's economic welfare. Okay. Some people would say that is a government decision, it's a policy decision, and the courts shouldn't interrogate that, because then they are getting involved in politics, which is not their role. Okay. Other people would say, look, we have a constitution that makes the constitution the supreme law of the land, that makes the constitutional court the supreme guardian of our democracy. And in that context, well, actually, yes, the courts must get involved in those kinds of questions if it looks like there are abuses of power. So we get down to this question of what is the role of our courts. At the moment, it seems to me that judges are being quite conservative. They're showing a lot of what we call deference to government. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Courts can't just leap in and say this is bad and substitute their moral judgment for what government has done. So there must be a sustained build-up, a rational build-up where the courts interrogate matters, and that will happen generically over time. So yes, I think that the courts will entertain it. They will do so in the same spirit that they've done before. Which is that they will exercise caution, they will exercise deference, but ultimately, one would hope that, the right answer prevails at the end of the day.
Okay, thanks. I realized that was a bit of a difficult question, but I think your answer is quite useful there. And then just the final one on, again, in the more specific avenue / nature, if the formation of the Command Council, the National COVID-19 Command Council, is found to be irregular, would this mean that all the regulations it has promulgated are thus irregular as well?
Well, again, this comes down to a factual inquiry. So it's important to note that actually, in reality, we don't know any more about the Command Council than when I first raised the query 3 weeks ago in an op-ed. In fact, we know less because there's been more confusion. So firstly, we have to work out exactly what the National Command Council is. Then we have to work out if it's been taking decisions. We have to work out if it was entitled to take those decisions. If it turns out, and that's a big if, that legally it wasn't entitled to take decisions, well, then those decisions that it did take would be unlawful. Okay. But you'd have to look at each individual decision and say, was the Command Council involved there or was it not? And that's a difficult question, because in order to look at that, you have to dig deep into government's functioning. You'd have to look at cabinet minutes, and then when you start going into those inquiries, you would likely find government to give you responses like, oh, it's classified, or oh, you can't access cabinet minutes, or So this whole ball of yarn is very big, and it's very difficult to unravel. It takes time. So a lot of people I know it's a bit of a sidetrack, but a lot of people said, why aren't you guys just going to court? If you believe in your case, just go to court. And it's not as simple as that.
It sounds like a very American approach. Just go to court.
Go to court. So it's not as simple as that. You have to try and get answers, because when you go to a court looks at the facts.
Okay.
So we have to get as many facts as we can to establish whether going to court is even viable, and if we do go to court, what the prospects of success are. So it's a very difficult process.
Okay. Thanks. I think that's helpful.
Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I
get
think so.
lost on with
No, I think so. I wanted to give you the final word. Any sort of parting thoughts, anything you'd like to leave the viewers with? I wouldn't want to put you on the spot in terms of forecasting, maybe what you think the president will announce tonight. That's too specific a question, but just anything you wanted to leave the viewers with going forward.
Yeah, I think that, there needs to be, and I would encourage people to think more broadly. It seems like as a citizenry, we are, and I include myself in this, we are a little bit too easily distracted, and I'll give you a couple of examples. The president's mask issue, however long ago that was. There were some very serious decisions that were being taken, but for 2 days, all that the entire country was talking about was the president and his mask. Then we had the hot food debacle, which is very important legally, but there was a disproportionate amount of distraction caused by it. Today again, we have these bizarre directions coming out, and that's all that anyone is talking about. Now, I'm not saying at all that people shouldn't be talking about this.
Of course.
But what I'm saying is I'm trying to sound an alarm bell, and I'm saying don't focus solely on these things that are patently ridiculous. Try and look at the big picture. Stand back. Look at what has happened historically, over the last 5 weeks, which feel like an eternity. I think that's very important. And look at very fundamental issues. For example, this freedom of speech issue. Look at it, interrogate that, fight it. Don't be intimidated, because I think what's happening to at least some extent is that there's this culture of silence that is being cultivated by fear. Sure. People are afraid to stand up because they're saying, well, if we say this, maybe it's fake news and we'll get arrested, or maybe there'll be a public backlash. So when you allow regulations like that to stand, and when you allow your civil liberties to be restricted like that without fighting back, you create a culture where you kill debate. And that doesn't even necessarily have to come from government. It just, when society doesn't fight, that's the culture that you develop. And
it's a way of self-censorship in a way.
Yeah, exactly. It's censorship by fear, and it's almost like this has been happening to us for 5 weeks or 6 weeks solid. And now at least I'm starting to see that there's a bigger trend in people stepping out and speaking up. And maybe that's because people are just getting fed up.
Sure.
Maybe at the beginning there was support for government. But and now maybe that sentiment is waning. But legally and constitutionally, I can't overemphasize the importance of people raising their voices. And by raising their voices, I don't only mean speaking out about it on social media or whatever. I mean going to court, taking those steps. Lawyers at this point you will find by and large very willing to act pro bono. We acknowledge the duty that rests on our shoulders, so you will find legal help if you look for it. So I'd encourage focus on things like this freedom of expression. I would also encourage people to focus on things that, to my mind, have received very little attention. One of those is this thing about digital surveillance. There are parts of that regulation that, to me, are definitely ultra vires. What that means is that they go beyond government's powers, far beyond. And when you are being surveilled, that is a very, very big infringement of many of your rights. It's also particularly dangerous because a lot of us don't understand how technology works. So when government says to you something like, we're going to de-identify the information, well, what is
that's such a dry, abstract concept. Yeah.
So what I'm getting at is that, we need to start saying to government, give us information, You know, give us data. Tell us what you mean when
Mm-hmm.
you make these regulations. You know, another key thing that strikes me. Sorry, I'm just
No,
kind of
please.
talking, because, you know, another thing that strikes me is that we have not had access to the core data that government is relying on.
Yeah.
So we've been given some peeps, you know, into government's modeling.
Mm-hmm.
But the question we must be asking from a rationality perspective, what is the value of modeling if we don't have the source data on which the modeling is based or is being updated?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you can talk in big legal terms about rationality and justifiability and all of these things. But if you look at a practical example, how do we critique the rationality of a model if we don't know the data on which that model is based? And how do we assess the rationality of the decision to put us into lockdown if we can't assess the rationality of the model?
Yep.
So there's this whole chain effect that unfolds. And to me, it comes back to a very, very simple point. Our government is not being transparent. It's not giving us information, and we must start requesting that with you know, great momentum. That I suppose is as much as I can say on that topic.
I will definitely agree there and reinforce that we're seeing more calls for transparency and the government to just be open and communicate properly. And I think we as citizens can expect that. Before the lockdown, South Africa's economic growth was maybe hovering between 1% and 2%. The lockdown is going to, you know, who knows what that's going to do to it. Before the lockdown, there were more than 10 million unemployed people in the country. Who knows how many that will be now. So the lockdown is having a very serious effect on the country, and every South African deserves to know where the data is coming from and on what data the models are based. But Erin, thank you so much. I think we'll wrap up there. Would you like to give the viewers anywhere where they can follow you, anywhere they can keep in touch with your work?
Yeah, they can follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle comes from a nickname that I got from Jeremy Nell's show. It's Advocate Leopard. So they can follow me there. That's pretty much where I post most of my updates. Yeah, any engagement is welcome. Any critique is welcome, and I will try and answer as many questions as I can.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Erin, so much for your time. Viewers, thank you as well for joining us once again. I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it informative. Good luck for the President's announcement this evening. Let's see what he has in store for us. Please remember to like this video. Please share it all over your different social media platforms. Please also subscribe to our YouTube channel. We greatly appreciate your support. If you gain value from the work we do, please also consider donating to the Free Market Foundation. We rely on your support to continue doing our work, all of the articles, the press releases, the reports, everything else we're doing at the moment to put pressure on government. Please support us where and if you can. Please follow us on Facebook and Twitter, Free Market Foundation South Africa, and you can find all of our written work on www.freemarketfoundation.com. But for now, we'll say bye and talk to you again soon.